From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Donald Trump demands lower oil prices and interest rates while addressing the World Economic Forum at Davos before signing executive orders today on AI and crypto. We'll have new details ahead.
This on the same day a federal judge blocks the president's executive order ending birthright citizenship. We'll discuss the president's changes to border policy and immigration with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis.
As the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas enters its fifth day, Secretary of State Marco Rubio reiterating U.S. support for Israel in a call with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll hear today from Aaron David Miller at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. That's later this hour. Thank you for joining us on the Thursday edition, the late edition of Balance of Power. We're live in Washington, where Kaylee, Donald Trump has done it again, driving the news cycle late in the day with another flurry of executive actions.
Yeah, these are some of the ones that Wall Street was waiting for, at least if you're in the tech and crypto community. A suite of executive orders around crypto and artificial intelligence, including creating a working group that within the next 6 months is going to provide some digital asset recommendations to the president. And they're going to look at that reserve thing, though not a Bitcoin-specific reserve. So some people may still end up disappointed.
National digital asset stockpile.
Yeah.
I don't know if it says Bitcoin, but I guess we're going to have to wait some time, some 6 months to your point. Kaylee, the president speaking earlier from the Oval Office in the midst of all this.
When the oil comes down, it'll bring down prices, then you won't have inflation, and then the interest rates will come down.
You said that you would demand that the interest rates come down.
Well, I would put in a strong statement.
Do you expect the Fed to listen to you?
Yeah.
Are you going to talk to Powell about this and bringing the rates down?
At the right time, I would.
So another instance of answering random questions from the press in the midst of signing executive orders. We've seen this a few times already this week. And joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Laura Davison. So, Laura, obviously we'll see what Chairman Powell thinks about that, I'm sure, Wednesday when he has his own press conference next week. But if we could just talk about these executive orders in particular. David Sachs was in the room, the AI and crypto czar for the White House. These are ones that were teased. It just took us a few days to get them.
It took us a few days, and they don't go as far as some in the industry were hoping. So there's this working group, and basically this is a task force that'll come together and do some studies and say, here's what we think the legislative priorities should be, the regulatory priorities, and this Bitcoin digital asset stockpile. This is something that the crypto industry really wants because it would mean that the U.S. government would start holding and potentially buying digital assets. On the AI front, it's a little bit more regulatory, peeling away some existing regulations that David Sachs and others said were hampering the industry and trying to create more innovation and direct more policies there to help spur that. This is really tricky because you can't just sort of, as Trump has learned, just say, OK, we want to build this industry. He had a big AI announcement at the White House that was quickly criticized by his own confident months who said, hey, look, there may not be the money behind this. So this is sort of a step one, give some of his key donors what they want, but not massive changes just yet.
I guess some in the crypto space were hoping for a little more on this, much like some have been hoping for more details on tariffs. Donald Trump spoke about this today. He addressed Davos virtually from Washington, sharing this idea related to tariff plans.
Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. We're bringing them down very substantially, even from the original Trump tax cuts. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff.
He's put February 1st out there as a deadline, essentially, to have some sort of tariff plan together. Talk about China, Mexico, Canada. Do we expect news on that front by the 1st?
We're expecting to hear something, but it's very possible that this date shifts, or it's not all three of those countries, or it's not some of those tariff levels. We've heard 25% for Canada and Mexico and 10% for China. It was interesting today in his speech. He really went hard on both Mexico and Canada, talked a lot about trade deficits. What he didn't mention when it came to tariffs was China. He was actually very friendly towards Xi, mentioned that Xi had called him recently and said he had a good relationship. So there's a certain kind of posturing that's happening here. Trump, if you ask him directly, directly about China tariffs. He'll talk about that, but it's not the thing he's leading with. It's really more the neighbors to the north and south, which is really a different posture than we had, even just 6 months ago.
Well, and he says part of the reason he has an issue with neighbors to the north and south is because of the flow of things coming over the border, which he wants to crack down on, including immigration more widely. And he has signed a series of executive orders to that extent, Laura. He was dealt a blow today, though, by a court in Seattle, which at least for now is blocking his birthright citizenship order on the grounds, according to the judge, that it's blatantly unconstitutional. What happens next with this one?
So this was really the plan. They knew going in that this was going to be challenged in court. But the idea here is you throw a bunch of things out and see what can stick. You may not get the full order approved, but maybe you can chink away a little bit. Trump has really talked about birthright citizenship. He doesn't like it. This is something that really riles his supporters up, and it is a popular thing among his base. When you talk about it more broadly, when the polling suggests that people are more supportive of birthright citizenship than Trump would suggest. But, he may be able to get at least a partial win here, and that's what this legal case is all about.
Laura, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Laura Davison with us in Washington. As we turn to confirmation hearings on Capitol Hill, where earlier this afternoon, John Ratcliffe was confirmed by the Senate, 74-25, to become the next director of the CIA. This as two key Republicans now say they will not support President Trump's controversial pick for defense secretary, of course, Pete Hegseth. Today, Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Susan Collins of Maine both say they will vote against the nomination. Nonetheless, his nomination passed a crucial step in the Senate this afternoon. And joining us is Bloomberg's Megan Scully. The math is pretty simple here. He can't afford to lose a lot more if he's going to be the next defense secretary. Two more.
Two more, yes. He can't lose more than three. So what we saw today was a test vote, essentially, for the Hegseth nomination. And it only needed to clear a 50 vote, a simple majority. Mm-hmm. And that's what he needs for the ultimate confirmation, which could come as early as tomorrow. And so barring any, more revelations from his past, we do expect him to be confirmed. Republican senators are more or less declaring victory at this point.
It's just a question of timing, I suppose, because it is the Senate. You can throw up procedural hurdles, as we already saw Democrats do with Ratcliffe, only for him to ultimately be confirmed today. So just walk us through how long this is going to take and whether this is going to be a working weekend for everyone involved, yourself included.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is Democrats kind of pulling out all stops here in terms of slowing things down. Not necessarily for some of the nominees, like Ratcliffe, not particularly controversial. He was confirmed with plenty of Democratic support. But by slowing him down, they got to delay the Hegseth vote. And we're just going to kind of keep seeing this sort of airport delay effect happen through the weekend and into next week. They have 30 hours now before they get to a vote on Hegseth, so they could stay in late tomorrow or they could come back on Saturday. There is talk of keeping them in over the weekend, which the Senate doesn't typically like to do, but they do very much want to get these positions confirmed. So, Besant, the Treasury nominee, not particularly controversial, but we could see them running out the clock because they want to, forestall a vote on, Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., all of whom have their hearings next week.
Well, to that point, next week is going to be a ripper, as they say. Kash Patel, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., all in confirmation hearings. So pop your corn. We're hearing that Tulsi Gabbard may have the most trouble out of the three.
Yes, certainly her 2017 trip to Syria has raised a lot of alarm bells on both sides of the aisle. There's a lot of concern about, her connections to Assad and what they discussed in that meeting. That's going to be drilled down on deeply in that confirmation hearing. I think the RFK Jr. confirmation hearing is also going to be pretty controversial, given particularly his stance on vaccines, some of his financial disclosures that have come out, and then also his stance on abortion tends to rile the right. So he's getting kind of potential opposition from both sides.
So much to look forward to, as if this week has not brought us
it's all coming.
Enough. Bloomberg's Megan Scully, thank you so much. And still ahead, we're going to take a closer look at Congress's tax plans with Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What may have made sense to some of my colleagues back in 2017 I think in some of these states, they're starting to see that $10,000 cap is woefully insufficient and really does cause harm to taxpayers. So, look, we're working through this. I have confidence, certainly in my conversations with the president, that we are going to get a tax deal done that does lift the cap on salt and really provides real tax relief to middle-class families.
Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York on the early edition of Balance of Power today, talking about his push to raise the SALT cap. And joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is his colleague and fellow New Yorker who also would like to see this happen, Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis. Congresswoman, welcome back to Balance of Power. When we consider what this is ultimately going to fit into, a piece of the puzzle, is it a requirement for you and your colleagues who are pushing for a higher SALT cap that this be included in a budget reconciliation package, knowing that there may be some difficulty in getting 218 votes for that? Or can you get guarantees elsewhere that the SALT cap will be lifted and not just in one big bill?
Look, the SALT deduction needs to be increased in this reconciliation. That is where the provisions of the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act will be extended and enhanced. That's where we're going to try to incorporate some of President Trump's campaign pledges, such as providing relief for tipped workers, for senior citizens. And I think there's really no other way to do it other than putting it in this bill. And I think it's also where we would get the votes, because as we're trying to build consensus, there are members in border states that want to see improvements for border security. We all do. And those in energy producing states who want to see some regulations repealed and domestic production of energy increasing. And again, we all do. So I think there's something for everyone in this package, and that is how we're going to build the consensus to get it through. But there are way too many members of the SALT caucus from New York, New Jersey, California, for them to ignore this issue, which really is about fairness, because New York pays so much in taxes to the federal government, and we are a donor state. We do subsidize other states in the nation. And as we talk about spending cuts, New York's also going to have some cuts. And our principle of being the Republican Party is to give people back their own money, right? To let taxpayers keep their money. So if we're going to have savings, it should be reflected by allowing the taxpayers of our states to receive an increased SALT deduction.
Are you drawing a line, not unlike Mike Lawler, that you would not vote for a tax package if it does not include a raise on the cap when it comes to SALT?
Well, look, there needs to be a raise on the cap, and the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, cannot return. Now, I'm not set on any particular number. I'm not saying if we don't get this, then I'm not voting for it. I'm not drawing a red line like that. But there's enough of an understanding within our conference, with our leadership, with the president, that the SALT cap needs to be addressed, and also that the alternative minimum tax can't come back. And that's important because middle-class families were getting crushed by the AMT. It actually prevented many in my district in Staten Island and Brooklyn from benefiting from the SALT deduction. And so we can't have, one thing happen and the other thing not. We have to ensure that the SALT deduction increase, and I'm flexible on that. We'll see what number we can come up with that can get to the 218. But we have to also make sure that the alternative minimum tax is not returned, which I think, generally speaking, that is favorable.
Congresswoman, obviously President Trump has had a busy few days, including earlier today, his virtual appearance at Davos, where he did talk about tax policy and who is going to come together to actually get this thing passed. Take a listen to what he said, and we'll have you respond.
To further unleash our economy, our majorities in the House and Senate, which we also took along with the presidency, are going to pass the largest tax cut in American history, including massive tax cuts for workers and family, and big tax cuts for domestic producers and manufacturers. And we're working with the Democrats on getting an extension of the original Trump tax cuts.
Are Democrats playing a role here, Congresswoman?
Well, look, I think many Democrats will vote against it regardless, just because Republicans put it together. And that's unfortunate. But there certainly is an opportunity here for bipartisanship. The 2017 tax cuts, it created millions of jobs. It lifted middle-class wages. It brought unemployment to record lows, particularly for minorities. And I will also say that the child tax credit was doubled, the standard deduction was doubled. So there were a lot of good things for our working and middle-class families. And so it's hard, I think, for Democrats to vote against it. You know, I think that, especially seeing after the success that the first law had. Remember, the projections were very wrong. It actually brought in $1.5 trillion more in revenue than it was originally projected by the Congressional Budget Office. So this was a successful piece of legislation. And I think a lot of the Democrats who are from SALT states would actually be more inclined, or should be more inclined, to support it if we can increase that deduction. I think they also understand that the reason why we're seeking relief for SALT from the federal level is because our mayors and our governors keep abusing taxpayers. And so that's what President Trump understands. That's what my colleagues understand. And I think we are going to deliver more tax relief for these individuals. The other thing I'm looking at is actually a bonus deduction or an increased deduction for senior citizens to try to offset some of the taxes they have to pay on their Social Security income, which also falls within the pledge of President Trump.
Congresswoman, we usually get into immigration and border security when you're with us. It's a priority of yours, and I'm sure you saw a federal judge today move to block President Trump's executive action on birthright citizenship. I don't know, as a lawmaker, if you would have preferred a legislative solution to this, but are you worried, or how worried are you, that some of the EOs that Donald Trump has signed specifically to the border will be undone by the courts?
Well, first I'll say that some of the other executive orders, like the ones that we're seeing where ICE has gone in now in Chicago and New York City and is detaining and deporting dangerous individuals. Just today, we've seen an individual who was an MS-13 gang member, someone who had committed a sex assault, and somebody who was convicted of drunk driving, all detained and removed from New York. So that's great news for the people that I represent. The people have been very worried about the crime that has been taking place by cartels and gang members and other criminals. Now, with regards to the birthright citizenship, this is an interesting case, and I'm very curious to see how it does play out, because the only precedent that there is, I believe the year is 1898, and the only precedent back then, the individual was a legal immigrant. So I think there is an opportunity for President Trump to end the birthright citizenship if the parents are here illegally. I think that is the difference. And we'll see how this does play out in court. But I think that a lot of people, if the parents are here illegally, think that the birthright citizenship should not be valid. So again, it's something that's never actually been tested in the courts before. And I'm very curious to see how this plays out.
Would you support a measure on birthright citizenship being included in a budget reconciliation package that, for all of our talk about the role tax plays in that ultimate big bill or multiple bills, border and immigration issues are supposed to be addressed through it too?
Well, and anything that goes in reconciliation needs to have a fiscal angle to it, right? It has to have some type of budget purpose. That is the point of the reconciliation. And so I don't know that something like that would fit in. There's other things we can do as it relates to immigration and the border. We could certainly fund technology, hire more border agents, and do some other things, put money toward, let's say, judges to hear cases and streamline the immigration system. But in terms of birthright citizenship, I'm not so sure that would fit in. It would probably be thrown out by the parliamentarian.
Good to see you, Congresswoman. Thanks for being with us, as always, on Bloomberg. Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, we thank you. Coming up, the wildfires continue to rage in Southern California. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall will give us an update next. It's on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thousands in Southern California were forced to evacuate overnight as dry winds stoked new wildfires in the region. Washington, meanwhile, is debating the way forward on aid to the Los Angeles area. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall has the latest. Tyler.
Well, Kaylee, President Trump will travel to Los Angeles tomorrow to tour devastation from the fires. It's projected to be one of the costliest natural disasters in U.S. history. AccuWeather data projects there's anywhere from $52 to $57 billion in damage and economic loss. Thousands are beginning to file insurance claims, but will likely need more assistance. A recent study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia finds 40% of post-California wildfire claims were underpaid between 2013 and 2020. Now, President Trump has suggested he could withhold federal aid to California till the state makes changes to how it manages its water resources. It continues a long-standing feud with Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom.
That thing went for 4 or 5 days. Nobody was even fighting it because they didn't have any water. Their fire departments aren't funded properly. I don't think we should give California anything until they let water flow down into their...
From the north to the south.
This is a political thing.
Governor Newsom has launched an investigation into the state's water system, but says Los Angeles does not get its water resources from the northern part of the state. He says it's more about city infrastructure and the ability to deliver water locally. Now, Bloomberg's The Big Takeout today cites Labor Department data showing that the number of California salaried firefighters has actually stagnated in recent years. The idea of conditioning aid or tying it to a debt ceiling vote, which, as you both know, is something that has been floated here in Washington, is complicating matters on both sides of the aisle. Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries said today Democrats would reject any such proposal.
It's a non-starter. There will be a time and place to do an after-action analysis as it relates to state preparation for extreme weather events. And if the House Republicans want to have this discussion, we will make sure in the United States of America and in the Congress that it's a comprehensive one.
Joe and Kaylee, the issue will come to a head soon as Congress likely has to tackle it ahead of the March 14th government funding deadline.
So, Tyler, we finished last year talking about FEMA funding following the hurricanes in the southeast. We've started this year talking about FEMA funding with the wildfires in California. Why is this constantly such an issue?
It's actually become a chronic and bipartisan issue. Joe, we know that Congress had to actually reopen the fiscal year 2025 funding early because of this backlog of cases. Now, Congress did allocate $29 billion to replenish the FEMA disaster relief fund back in December, but that likely won't be enough. The both of you actually caught up with a former FEMA administrator, Brock Long, back in October during those hurricanes that you mentioned, and he said that this actually goes beyond Washington and that Washington and lawmakers need to pair with local communities to think of some other creative ways around this.
Great reporting, Tyler. Thank you. Tyler Kendall with us in Washington. Coming up, we'll look at President Trump's agenda for the Middle East after the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It's on day 5. Aaron David Miller's up next on Bloomberg.
It's a very tricky place. It's very tricky. We'll see. And if something does happen, they will not be happy. The Biden people couldn't make the deal. They were working on it for a year and a half. They couldn't make a deal. We got it done prior to the inauguration. We said it has to be before the inauguration. I mean, the deal should hold, but if it doesn't hold, there'll be a lot of problems.
President Trump earlier today in the Oval Office talking with reporters there about whether the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas will hold. Joining us now with more, a voice of experience, Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's great to have you back, sir. We can argue all day, I suspect, over who was deserving of credit in actually reaching this point. But on day 5 now that Donald Trump is in office and knowing the far-right element that Benjamin Netanyahu has to deal with in the Knesset, how sturdy is this deal?
You know, it's not a deal between the U.S. and Switzerland, right? It's between two combatants, the government of Israel, and in this case, the most right-wing government in Israel's history, against Hamas, right? An organization which by American law and statute has been declared a foreign terrorist organization. So both of them decided, largely, I think, out of Hamas's weakness as a consequence of Israel's escalation dominance in Lebanon vis-a-vis Iran, that it was better to try to make a deal now. And I think Netanyahu was moved by the fact that he, I think, came to the conclusion that he might not be able to manipulate President Trump the way he played to a large degree President Biden over the course of the last, particularly the course of the last 6 months. So each of them have a stake, at least in seeing the first phase implemented. Beyond that, Joe, it's really going to be extremely difficult.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, is that, yes, this is a deal that was about a cessation of hostilities, the exchanging of hostages and prisoners. But these are also a period of weeks that are intended to be used to try to get to a phase 2, a longer term solution for what happens in Gaza. Do you see this as being adequate time for that to be ironed out, knowing how far apart Israel and Hamas have long been on that day after question?
Gail, it's a great question. It's less a matter of time and more the absence of will. Just phase 2 requires Hamas to free all of the hostages. If the first phase is done, there'll be roughly 65 men over 50, IDF soldiers, both living and dead, 65. The Israelis estimate that half of those are no longer living. And the war has to end, and the Israelis have to withdraw from Gaza. And that is something, frankly, that this Israeli government seems to me is going to be an extreme, will have a very difficult time doing, because Hamas is going to survive as an insurgency, and it belies the whole notion that that the Israeli prime minister has achieved a, quote, total victory, end quote.
So considering the stages here, if we move beyond week 6 and this ceasefire, essentially temporary ceasefire, becomes indefinite, does the former diplomat in you worry about losing deadlines that kind of put a marker here for something to be met? If this becomes indefinite, how quickly can it spiral out of control?
It's a fascinating question. Nobody ever lost money betting against Israeli-Palestinian peace. The intriguing feature of this deal is that day 16, that's what, 13 days from now, negotiations over phase 2 will begin. And whoever decided to put this in the agreement, it was one of the key negotiators, maybe Bill Burns, CIA director, basically has a clause which basically says the ceasefire will continue as long as the negotiations continue. So my prediction would be they're going to get through phase 1, and you're going to see a lot of foot dragging on both sides, weeks perhaps. But the final point, I think, is clear. Donald Trump claimed responsibility for this deal. He deployed his key negotiator, who played a significant role in helping to achieve it. He owns it. And this is going to be the first, probably the first foreign policy test of his credibility, his power, his capacity as a negotiator. And we're going to find out reasonably soon whether or not he has the leverage and the will and the skill to make this happen.
Well, so I do wonder what you make of, for example, Donald Trump speaking at Davos today, and really the only geopolitical conflict he was addressing was the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. He wants to see a negotiated end to that as well. Plus the reporting we have today that Marco Rubio, the newly confirmed Secretary of State, is not making a trip to the Middle East or even to parts of Europe, but instead to Latin America and Panama as his first trip in his official capacity. What does that suggest to you about the administration's real focus here?
It's fascinating. I worked for 6 secretaries of state, and the key ingredient for an effective, consequential secretary of state, other than the capacity to negotiate, is to have the full faith and confidence of the president, because it takes our allies and adversaries 5 minutes to figure out whether or not his chief diplomat speaks with the authority and has the confidence and trust of the president. No secretary of state I ever worked for would essentially surrender Russia and the Middle East as key areas in which to try and make something happen. Clearly going to Panama, not to put too fine a point on it, obviously has a purpose. Rubio, I think, is talented in the sense that he knows his way around the international scene and stage. And I think it strikes me that Latin America, Venezuela will be a key area of his interest. I think, though, that in the end, Donald Trump's going to rely on the deal makers. The Stephen Witkoffs, for example, and perhaps others we don't know yet to actually do some of the diplomacy.
Aaron, Donald Trump had an address today, virtually, of course, to the World Economic Forum in Davos, basically his first opportunity to address foreign leaders since being inaugurated earlier this week. Aside from the Dear Leader interview that we saw with some of the folks who were on stage, how did Donald Trump present himself?
Well, I mean, he must love Davos. He was there in 2018. He was there in 20. I think he was the first American president since Bill Clinton to go in 2018. I think he likes rattling the European sphere, so to speak. I mean, it's incredible. As the first trip he took to his first foreign foray as president in 2017 was not to Canada, not to Britain. He did go to Europe to NATO meeting, but the first stop he made was to Saudi Arabia. And I think that reflects the sort of area of interest that he wants to focus on. The Abraham Accords, maybe an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal. The kings, the emirs, the crown princes, they like to flatter him. He likes them. They're, in many respects, strong, in their case, authoritarian leaders. I think Donald Trump obviously has those sorts of tendencies. But I think that's what we can expect. The transactional man deals. And the Europeans, I think, by and large, really don't interest him.
Well, to your point earlier, it is about the president, yes, but it's also about the people around him who may be facilitating his efforts and working on these deals. We've obviously talked about Steve Witkoff, but I do wonder, especially given the high-profile role Bill Burns, as CIA director, has played in the Middle East in recent months. He obviously is now out. John Ratcliffe, as of today, has been sworn in. Do you see the CIA continuing to play that kind of role, or was that specific to Mr. Burns?
I think Bill Burns' role was unique. I mean, he's the first diplomat, career diplomat, or the second, basically, to become CIA director. Biden had tremendous confidence in him. And, you know, the three basic crises of the Biden administration, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Gaza, Bill Burns was up front, playing central, primary roles in all of them. I don't see John Ratcliffe playing that role. I would remind myself and the two of you, though, with respect to appointments, that Donald Trump in 4 years had 6 secretaries of Homeland Security, 4 attorney generals, 4 secretaries of defense, 4 directors of national intelligence, and 2 secretaries of state in 4 years. I think that's a cautionary tale to the appointments that he's already made.
Your point is well taken. We appreciate you joining us, as always. Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much. And coming up, we'll have more on President Trump's big return to the world stage in reaction to his virtual remarks at Davos with our political panel. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
My administration is acting with unprecedented speed to fix the disasters we've inherited from a totally inept group of people and to solve every single crisis facing our country. This begins with confronting the economic chaos caused by the failed policies of the last administration.
President Donald Trump virtually addressing the World Economic Forum at Davos earlier today. And joining us now for more reaction here on Bloomberg TV and radio is this evening's political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, President and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist, alongside Kristen Hahn, Rock Solutions partner and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. Certainly Donald Trump is not exaggerating when he says he's been moving quickly. We have seen a ton of executive orders signed, including a whole host more this afternoon, and once again answering questions from the press. Is this going to slow down anytime soon, Sarah?
Not in the first 100 days. We're all going to be exhausted.
We
That's
already
the way it's
are.
going to be. Yeah, first 100 days, he's going to push hard.
So
Absolutely.
we have this in common. How about lawmakers? Because he could exhaust them as well, and there's still no direction on a way forward when it comes to reconciliation or the things that we have been talking about with you for weeks.
Well, I can tell you the members are exhausted. They were looking forward to going home this evening, especially the House members. But they're coming closer on rec. I still think reconciliation is going to be one bill instead of two. But, you know, there's some tough members in the House on the Republican side that they have to work with, and they think they can only get one vote out of them. So that's why they're working on one. They're hoping to do this by April.
Well, we'll get more on that in a minute. I do, though, want to stick with Donald Trump for a second, Kristen, because he has gotten a lot of wins, shall we say, or at least been able to tout a lot he's done in these first few days of the administration. He was dealt a little bit of a setback today. A court in Seattle blocking his birthright citizenship order, saying that it's blatantly unconstitutional. Do you think this was actually, though, by design? Because that's what we keep hearing.
I mean, I don't know if it's by design. I think that there are a lot of things when you do, say, like things by executive order. This is why it's not easy to get through things through Congress, and Congress isn't always working together across party lines or even within their own party to get things done, which are lasting, right? And stand the test of time over multiple administrations. So it's not surprising to me that this happens. I don't know if they thought that far ahead. You might be being smarter than they are when they're thinking about these executive orders.
They've had 4 years to think about that.
They've had 4 years to think about it. But I just think, I mean, he was going to do this. He told us he was going to do this. He's doing all these things. And then the cards will fall where they may. And there will be, judicial action. There will be lawsuits. And same thing happened with the Obama administration and the Biden administration. And so he should expect that.
Well, so are we going to be in a world where some of this falls on lawmakers? Promises made by the president on the campaign trail cannot all be fulfilled through executive order. And there could be some leftovers, big ones like this, for instance, that would require a legislative solution.
I think the legislative solution is there.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the members are willing to go in and change the 14th Amendment and make sure that men and women who are born here aren't naturally
Is the conference
citizens.
together on that?
A lot of the Republicans are. I mean, you'd be surprised.
You're not passing that with Democrats, I'm assuming.
No, this would have to be a full Republican. But you'd be surprised at the support that is there. I mean, obviously, it's been around for years. But now, a lot of people are starting to question this. Like, we can't have illegals coming here, giving birth, and all of a sudden their kids are definitely American citizens. That's a problem. So I think you're going to see that changed by the end of the year.
I do wonder about Democrats on these border and immigration issues, though, Kristen. With what we've just seen with the Lake and Riley Act, a lot of Democrats actually coming and supporting that legislation. Obviously, a lot of post-morteming of the election, if you will, and the idea that Democrats should have been stronger at the border. If you listen to, say, Ruben Gallego from Arizona, is there actually going to be more Democratic support potentially for some of these legislative initiatives than we might have thought previously?
I think there has been. I mean, you look at the Lincoln Riley Act. You look at, there was very significant and serious conversations when it came to immigration last Congress. I mean, there really was. Behind the scenes, Republicans, Democrats in the Senate, then they were communicating with Republicans and Democrats in the House. It really was, and I'm not trying to get overly political here, it was Trump that kind of derailed that effort. But when you look at the individual issues, like an issue of immigration, and you look like people like Senator Gallego, who you wouldn't naturally think of as, a moderate, who is an abortion state. He's thinking about these things. So I think that there's lots of room for it. Whether the olive branch will be extended across the aisle now that the Republicans have control of the Senate and the House and the White House, that's yet to be seen.
We have a great panel today. Sarah Chamberlain and Kristen Hahn will stay with us as the calendar of upcoming confirmation hearings takes shape. Next week is going to be a doozy. We'll have that next with the panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I am hearing a lot of women who are in our armed forces that they are concerned. First, his comments opposing women in combat with his own sexual assault allegations. There's a concern that it would halt or reverse progress that we have made addressing sexual assault in the military and creating an environment less hostile to women in the military.
Democratic Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan of Virginia on the early edition of Balance of Power, talking with us about Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth. Now, 2 Republican senators, both Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, have made clear they will not vote to confirm Hegseth. That developed today. Back with us this evening's political panel, Sarah Chamberlain and Kristen Hahn. Sarah, we still hear, though, that Donald Trump will get his defense secretary. I don't know if you see it that way, but he can afford to lose maybe another vote and still make this work, as opposed to, say, Tulsi Gabbard, who may have more to worry about.
I think he gets his defense pick. I said a few weeks ago on the show it was really going to come down to Senator Joni Ernst. Yeah. They were going to follow her. She came out in support. He'll get through. I don't think there's any question there. Now, the former Democratic Congresswoman, I think that's a whole other discussion. Yeah. I think she's now flip-flopped on FISA, so she's trying to be more appealing. I don't know if she's going to get there. There's a lot of senators that I've talked to that are a little uneasy with her.
Well, she doesn't have too much time here. Her confirmation hearing has been scheduled for next Thursday. Yeah. Kristen, do you see her as the one most in trouble, knowing the day before it's RFK Jr. and Kash?
I totally agree. She's the one most in trouble, and I would guess that there are a number of senators on the Republican side who would hope that it would even get to the hearing. So I think she wasn't even answering questions. The basic questions that the campaign was asking her, she wasn't filling out just the basic questionnaires. I'm not talking about FBI. I'm talking about there's so many flaws there and so many concerns. I think Hegseth obviously is gonna make it through, and we'll see what happens there. But yes.
So could she pull a Matt Gaetz, Sarah, and just take herself out of contention?
She could, but I don't see her doing that. I think she's counting on Donald Trump to push her through. So this one will be interesting to see how it all plays out.
We've heard off the record as many as 15 Republican no's. If that gets to the floor, does that sound?
That sounds
like
very
the ballpark we're in?
Yes, absolutely.
That should tell us a lot about where that goes. And she's going to be up the same day as RFK Jr. Is that right? We have
They're Wednesday. Kash Patel, RFK Jr. and Howard Lutnick.
So she'll be following that act on Thursday. It's going to be a pretty chippy week on Capitol Hill.
Well, so it does bring me to RFK Jr., though, because we've heard consistently that it's not just concerns about vaccines, for example, but that actually some on the right don't like his views on abortion. So he kind of has problems on all ends. But do you think ultimately they're only going to sink one?
I think I've said this, I think ultimately they'll sink one. It's too many to do. I think that there are a lot of issues, not just with RFK and what you've said, but the healthcare industry has a lot of issues with some of the things they're concerned about. I'm not saying that that's something that President Trump necessarily cares about, but there are a lot of people out there who are very concerned about HHS and what he could do over there. But I think ultimately it's one, and she's it.
Well, how powerful is the pharma lobby on this, meeting with lawmakers when it comes to vaccines, GLP-1s, big business?
They're certainly very powerful, but I do think he gets through, and I actually think he's going to get through in a bipartisan way.
No kidding.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll look ahead to that next week. Meantime, before we even get to those hearings, there's going to be a Republican conference meeting in Florida where Donald Trump will be attending on Monday, Sarah. So if we could look ahead a little bit, is that the day where we finally get clarity on what the path forward is and what the timeline is? Or do we actually all have that clarity and we're just still questioning it because John Thune still seems to want the two-bill thing?
I think we have clarity. I think it's going to be the House, and the House needs to vote one bill. So I think we do have clarity on that. And I do know President Trump does support a one-bill initiative. Thune, I think, is in talks with the Speaker, and he'll come around as well. I think what's going to happen in Florida, where luckily that's nice and warm compared to here, I think what you're going to see is he's going to give more of a pep rally, like make sure you're on my team. We got to get a lot done. We have 100 days to do this. Let's go. I think it's going to be more of a rally.
When's Hakeem Jeffries' pep rally? What is he telling his troops about what's coming?
I think, what was interesting to me, I mean, the Democrats have really rallied around Hakeem, so I don't think we need a pep rally necessarily for that. What I thought was really interesting is that the Republican-controlled Congress has to raise the debt limit. That's always been historically a very difficult thing for them to do when they're in control. And right now, Hakeem's signaling that they're not going to help. And generally, Democrats have had to help to do that. It's good governance. You're just basically paying your credit card. But there have been a lot of signaling that the Democratic caucus is behind Hakeem. People are willing to negotiate, but not if they're not asked to come to the table on a lot of these issues. I wouldn't expect it to happen too soon, either in the Congress.
Jeffries also said today, no how, no way will they essentially accept conditions on aid for California, where Donald Trump is actually going to visit tomorrow. And it's been floated that California aid, emergency aid, could be tied to a debt ceiling increase. Do you actually believe that? Or are there some members who aren't going to be able to vote down that aid, whatever it's attached to?
I think that there are some members that won't, but I think you're setting a very dangerous precedent when you're actually tying it to something like the debt limit increase. I mean, you have things that happen, and this is something that is not partisan. You're looking at, Katrina. I worked for a member of Congress in Louisiana when Katrina hit. I mean, This disaster happens in states all across this country. Sure. And I think that you'll have enough members come together on both sides of the aisle and be like, this has happened to me, this has happened to my constituents, this is happening to you, that we're not going to play politics with this.
All right, Kristen Hahn and Sarah Chamberlain, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much. And of course, for more coverage of all of this, you can always check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks indeed to our great panel and to you for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll do this all over again tomorrow, right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.